Hi there everyone. In this tutorial, we're going to look at how to make use of some granular synthesis modules in Reaktor. By the end of the video, you'll hopefully have a broader sense of what granular synthesis is, know some of the ways it can be applied in general, and be familiar with how to make use of it in two different fashions within Reaktor. Granular synthesis is a sample-based form of synthesis. It works by slicing a sample into microsamples that are called grains, which can be seen as more sonically malleable than the original sample. How granular synthesis is applied varies greatly depending on which program or platform one is using. For instance, it is one method commonly used in sequencers to adjust the pitch of samples whilst maintaining their temporal length. In this tutorial, I'll deal with another one of its main uses, that being the creation of weird and wonderful sounds that one would be unlikely to generate using other forms of synthesis. To do this, we'll begin by opening up a new Reaktor ensemble and going down to the instrument level. Reaktor obviously has its own pre-built instruments and effects that make use of granular modules, but here we'll be starting from scratch. First, let me give you a brief walkthrough of the main granular modules in Reaktor. If we navigate to the sampler section in the module drop-down menu, you'll see that there are three modules in the middle row, all of which are granular modules: Grain Resynth, Grain Pitch Former, and Grain Cloud. These three modules all work by reading samples imported into the sample map editor. Now, if we navigate to the delay section of the module drop-down menu, we see that there are another two modules with the grain prefix, Grain Delay and Grain Cloud Delay. Unlike the sampler modules, these delay modules are intended to read an incoming stream of audio. You may be familiar with the most basic module, Grain Resynth. In my first instrument, I'll be using the pitch former, which differs from resynth in several important ways. Firstly, pitch former doesn't alter the sample speed in order to transpose sample pitch, as resynth and non-granular samplers do. Instead, it forces a new absolute pitch of one's choice onto a sample, though obviously the closer the pitch is to that of the original sample, the less artificially altered the sound will be. As such, the formats of the sample are disassociated from one another. This means that one can also alter the format of a sample, as well as and independently from the pitch. Another notable difference is that pitch former lacks the grain length control input. Grain Cloud is the most complex of the grain sampler modules, and Grain Cloud Delay, which I'll be using for my second instrument, is effectively the same beast, but is applied to incoming audio instead of pre-chosen samples. These two modules unsurprisingly put emphasis on the concept of grain clouds, the simultaneous playback of different grains from the same sample. Whilst the other modules can do this by virtue of polyphony and looping, what sets the grain cloud modules apart is their distance input. As the distance or delay time between each grain can be controlled independently from grain length, many grains can be overlapped and played at once, and conversely, one can create long gaps between each grain. Grain delay is rather self-explanatory in terms of its parameters, so you guys can have a play with that yourself if you want. Here's a basic setup for an instrument based around the pitch former. I've already got a few samples loaded, as I've assumed you know how to use the sample map editor. If not, you may want to look that up. This basic setup presents quite a few drawbacks. For instance, a lot of the time when using samplers, you'll want looping to occur, and unless your samples have predefined loop information, you'll have to use the loop start and loop length inputs to set the loop. When experimenting with granular synthesis, it's likely you'll want to vary looping, so you'd want to use the module's loop controls to override any predetermined data anyway. This presents a problem in that if you have samples of different lengths, you'd have to change the loop start and loop length values every time you change sample. You can get around this with some very simple maths. Here's the method. Rather than using knobs to control the loop start and length, I've used an XY control because I feel it looks better in the panel. The default ranges for both X and Y are 0 to 1, which is exactly what we want. By multiplying both variables by the length output of the grain module, which gives the length of each sample in milliseconds, we map the controls to the length of each individual sample. You could use either variable for either control, but I've gone with using X for length and Y for the start point. Thus, we now have scaled controls for loop start and length. A similar problem presents itself with the start control, which determines at which point in the sample playback begins, and can be solved in the exact same way. Make sure to change the values of the start knob accordingly, setting the max of the range to 1 and the step size to 0.01. Change the length of the XY display in the panel so it matches that of the green module's sample display. You may notice that the loop end marker will disappear off the edge of the sample display if the loop length exceeds the remaining sample length. This doesn't really matter in this context, as the loop will in fact return to the start point as soon as you reach the end of the sample, but I'll come back to a similar problem later. As we're using the instrument more as a synth than a sampler, we don't really want to be able to move between similar sounding samples of different pitch on a MIDI keyboard, but rather want to be able to choose which sample we're going to mess with, and then just have the incoming MIDI note affect the pitch. We do this through use of the cell input, which overrides the P input's role in sample selection. Having added the select function, we're going to want to move our samples to the lowest ranges of the sample map, so that they can be easily selected by the knob. Because all my samples are percussive sounds, they all have a root key of 0. Don't forget to change the select knob value so that it matches the number of samples you have. To increase the control over pitch, we can add a knob to vary it on the semitone scale, as well as one to alter it on a cent scale. Be sure to adjust the range of the pitch knob down so that at the default level the samples don't already sound like they've been pitch shifted up massively. I've gone for -36 to 36 instead of the usual 0 to 127. Also, make sure the knob you create for fine-tuning has a range of -1 to 1 and a step size of 0.01. Now we're going to add some interest to the speed variable by using a subtle and random modulator. Create an empty macro and set up 2 LFOs. We'll use a slow random envelope to modulate the LFO's frequencies. Make sure to insert a rectifier as we don't want any negative values being sent out to the speed control. Create a constant of 1 for the LFO's amplitude, and then create a constant of 0.1 for the slow random's frequency. By having a small value like this being sent to the LFOs, and then multiplying the LFOs together, we ensure that the effect isn't too extreme. Create a constant of 1 for the slow random's amplitude. After multiplying the LFO's triangle outputs together, create another multiplier as an input for the speed knob. Send the input and combined LFO signals to the other multiplier. Insert a selector scanner and send the dry signal from the input to its 0 position input, and send the wet modulator applied signal to the scanner's 1 position input. Create a knob control for the position input and set the max to 1 and the step size to 0.01. Finally, put an event smoother after the position knob and add an output for the macro. One more improvement we can make is to multiply the smooth control by itself. This creates an exponential curve for its output values, meaning that the rate at which the sound gets rougher increases as you turn the knob down. We can, of course, also add a simple ADSR envelope to the instrument, thus allowing us to shape the sounds more. Here's a demonstration of the last few additions. For the delay effects we're now going to construct, there are similar problems to be solved and improvements to be made. We can begin by altering a few values. Change the buffer time to 1500 from 1000. Then, alter the grain length so that its maximum matches the buffer time. Another quick thing we can do is create another exponential control. Multiply the attack control by itself, and send it both to the attack and decay input. Rename the control attack/decay if you want. In the panel, switch the delay control to a horizontal fader and give it the same width as the buffer display. You could also change the grain length and distance controls. I've made mine knobs. You'll notice that a similar problem as we had with the first instrument arises when the grain length exceeds the remaining buffer length. Unlike with the sampler, this is a genuine problem, as when this occurs, silence is included in the grain. We can get around this with some maths. First, change the delay control values to 0 to 1 with a step size of 0.001. Bring up a multiplier adder and a subtract module. Put the delay control into the top input of the multiplier adder. Put a constant equal to the buffer time into the top input of the subtract module, and send the grain length control to the other input of the subtract module. Send the minus module signal to the second input of the multiplier adder, and then send the grain length control to the bottom input. The second port is acting like the length output of the sampler did, providing delay control with its scale. Adding the grain length to the third port tells the delay time to shift depending on the grain length. Next, we can create a better sounding ratio of distance between grains by multiplying the distance control by the grain length control. Before doing so, change the range of the distance controls to 0.1 to 2. Now we'll add a feedback function to the delay. Create another multiplier adder module and send the delay's output to the first multiplier input. Send the audio import to the add input. A feedback loop is created when we add a knob to the 3 multiplier input. This knob controls the amount of feedback. As would be expected, make the range of the knob 0 to 1 with a step size of 0.01. So that we can change the amount the delay module affects the incoming audio, and bypass it altogether if we want, we can use a crossfade module. Send the dry signal from the audio import to the 0-0 position input of the crossfade module, and send the signal from the delay module's output to the 0-1 input. Create a fader to control position. Another one of this module's problems is that it only has one audio input. To turn it into a stereo effect, control-click on the delay module, the crossfade, and the feedback math modules, and select Duplicate Selection. Now, all the knobs that control the original module's parameters also control this module's parameters, and all you need to do is wire a right channel audio import through this duplicated module. Finally, send a constant of -1 to the left module and +1 to the right module in order to pan the modules opposite each other. As it's an effect, you'll want to save this as a macro. As well as applying it to incoming real audio, you can use it on Reaktor synths and samplers as well. Here then is a composite instrument of both the granular pitchform instrument and the grain cloud delay effect. This concludes the tutorial. I hope you found it useful and now have a reasonable knowledge of how granular synthesis can be applied within Reaktor.